Hi everyone, my name is Kristen Splinter and I'm an Associate Professor and ARC Future Fellow at UNSW's Water Research Laboratory. I'd like to thank the IGCP team for the invitation and for running this, I think it is fourth workshop that they have as part of their Forecasting Coastal Change program. I'd also like to acknowledge that the slides that I'm presenting today are probably merely a tip of the iceberg of all the work that has been done on storm impact modeling, and I will focus on work that has been done by my team in particular, but by no means does that make it exhaustive in there. So when I was asked to talk about storm impact modeling, one of the things I think about is why do we care about storms? And we all know that these are things that can be not as well planned for as can things like sea level rise, and that's because storms are stochastic. But they can, as you can see in the pictures there below, rapidly change what our coastline looks like, and this can actually have very lasting impacts on our coastline as well, depending on how big the storm might be. We also tend to build a lot in our coastal zone, and as a result of the storms, this can have significant costs associated with it in terms of infrastructure loss, both in private property, as you can see there, where we've got some storms getting the erosion getting really close to some private homes, but also right behind those roads are major roads, and so we also need to look at how we can protect those. Now, I'd say in the last 10 years, we've seen a resurgence of the ideas of engineering with nature and nature-based solutions. And one of the big parts of those is using things like coastal dunes for natural protection against storms. And this makes it even more important that we understand storm impact modeling in terms of dune erosion so that we can better design these nature-based solutions for into the future and understand our natural coastal resilience. And now I thought I would start with first talking about maybe some of the simplistic ways that we can look at storm impact modeling, and I refer to that in terms of categorical type of approaches. Now these are great tools, and I've got 4 examples up there that you can dig into a little bit more if you're interested in them. But these are systems that can be run using really low computational costs, can be quite rapid, and can be done over much larger areas in there. So for example, the USGS Total Water Level and Coastal Change Forecast Viewer, which is run, and there can provide an estimate of the potential impact for a storm based on something called the Salinger scale, which I'll talk about next, which looks at the relative differences between the total water levels of an impending storm and the morphological features of, for example, a dune toe and dune crest. Now, with all of these systems, one of the things we had noticed when we were starting to develop ones here in Australia was that they were mostly based on areas where we had surge-dominated coastlines, and Australia is a little bit different than that. So when we look at those and why this might be important for us, again, here's just an example of the US East Coast. Down there, you can see this large continental shelf off the edge. And this, of course, allows for waves to dissipate their energy over much broader areas, and this can also induce larger setup and larger storm surge along that area of the coastline. Something like the southeast coastline of Australia, where I'm currently based in Sydney, though, has a very narrow continental shelf. And so what we see is a much bigger relative impact to the storm wave energy, as those waves are not able to dissipate their energy across a wide continental shelf. And so when we think of that in sort of some simplistic GIFs that my former student Chris Lehman made for us, examples there for sort of surge and a wave-dominated coastline there. You can see the different morphology, the very steep, narrow continental shelf on the right, a wide continental shelf on the left, and the larger storm surge that's showing up. And so total water levels are really important in some cases, whereas the actual wave energy may also be equally as important in other areas that should be considered. So when we were looking at developing a storm or an early warning system, a coastal storm early warning system here in Australia, one of the things we wanted to consider was both waves and water levels in here. And so I mentioned before that the Salinger storm scale is one very common approach that is used. And this looks at the difference between the morphological features such as dune toe and dune crest that may be taken at any point pre-storm. Sometimes they can be years old. And these are compared to estimates of tide, run-up, setup, and our total water level. And we can look at those relative components, and this tells us something about swash, collision, overwash, or inundation regimes in there. And it's the assumption that the erosion is going to scale here with the regime, although there's no explicit calculation thereof. These are also time dependent, and so with that, we're also usually looking at the maximum impact that we may have, and doesn't account for sort of the length of a storm as a result of that. Now, the erosion or the coastal storm matrix that we here developed, or Chris developed during his PhD, is a two-dimensional one, and it accounts for both the total water level or a flooding hazard scale on the left-hand side there, so the vertical scale, and then this new erosion hazard scale on the horizontal axis up there, which is going to be a function of the wave energy over a storm, for example. And so here we're going to look at whether or not we may have minor beach erosion, so maybe less than half the beach is going to disappear, or we're expecting to disappear, or the full beach would disappear for substantial beach narrowing, whether or not we expect the dune to be impacted, and this is going to actually be a function of the total water levels as well, whether or not we would expect dune retreat to occur. Now, looking at this, this was a much larger project that we had. It was an ARC linkage project, and we had a number of partners, such as the Bureau of Meteorology here in Australia, University of Western Australia, local governments, and the USGS was also part of this, given their extensive work that they have done in coastal early warning systems. Now, we wanted to have two different types of approaches. The first one, a Tier 1 approach here, looked at regional coverage. So we wanted to be able to categorically provide an estimate of what we thought the storm impact would be based on those two storm scales that I just showed you on the last one. But we wanted to do that over potentially hundreds of kilometers, but at a high resolution. For example, every 100 meters along the coast, where we might have data from, example, pre-storm LiDAR. And so this categorical approach is very simple to run, and so it can work really well. And we can dig down to it into individual beaches and provide estimates for, or even along a beach, what different scales we might expect to get. But we also acknowledge that at some beaches, we may want to do higher resolution, high fidelity, process-based modeling. These are areas which may have been identified as potential erosion hotspots or areas of strong concern. And that's where we may get into something like running an X-beach model, which will provide us with more information and more quantitative estimates of the erosion. So that does bring me to the second topic I wanted to touch base on, which was process-based models. I am acknowledging, though, here that I am skipping over the empirical approaches that do exist, the more simplistic ones, such as Overton and Fisher or Larson et al., the dune impact models that are there. I do touch base a little bit on them. Those are also a great set of work that are really easy to work on here as well. But when we're thinking of process-based models, these are things like eDune, SBeach, XBeach, and the good part about these, though, is that they're time dependent. Time dependent modeling will allow us to look at the length of a storm. It also allows us to transform waves from offshore onto the nearshore. This requires some information, though, about something like bathymetry, which can be really hard to get. And it does allow us to explicitly model sediment transports. We can model how a sandbar may move during a storm, but these are typically below the mean water level, where the sediment transport processes are well modeled. Above the mean water level, we still tend to rely on geometric relationships and not what I would say is hard physics in there. So, for example, it may look at a slope, a critical slope term, whether or not the thing was wet or dry, and determine whether or not that slope would be stable or not empirically, and adjust the profile as a result. So we dug into a bunch of these sort of different requirements that might exist here as part of Nash's PhD. He looked at was whether or not pre-storm bathymetry was actually going to be something that was absolutely required. So are up-to-date profiles for reliable estimates needed? And part of this is because these are probably the hardest piece of data for us to be able to get prior to a storm, and sand moves around a lot. And so whether or not a sandbar is in a certain location, if this will dictate how well these models will run, is really important for us. So as part of Nash's work, we did look at a number of different proxies for nearshore bathymetry. So we looked at this at two different sites, Narrabeen and at Duck, where we had a fair number of pre-storm profiles that were available at relatively close succession from the storm. We also looked at the average profile over all the data we had. We also did an empirical fit to the Dean equilibrium profile out to both 5 and 10 meters. Those are shown in the yellow and green. And then we also looked at an upper echelon or upper envelope and a lower envelope that are there in the blue and the purple. So you can see that we also separated that out into calibration and validation data so that we had a blind assessment for there. Now, if you see in the second panel, and I'm going to just focus here on on the Narrabeen data here. So these are calibration ones. Each of these bars represent the different bathymetry that was used. Over the 3 storms, you don't necessarily see clear winner. There's huge variability in the RMSE error above mean water level for these different ones. But we also don't see clearly that, for example, having the pre-storm profile was necessarily any better than having an average profile there in red. And so this actually means that it's not really a nail in the coffin if we don't have the most up-to-date data. However, having some reasonable estimate of the bathymetry is important. And from there, we can then calibrate these models because they have lots of coefficients that you can tune to and then go forward on that. However, it is good also to point out that you can see here over in the validation scores, we still see a large variability in the error statistics for each of the storms, which really kind of points out that we aren't resolving all the processes to be able to do this well with limited data. Now, kind of going on to that, one of the other challenges is that to be able to estimate impacts of storms, we need to have good time series data of waves and water levels. This was just some work that was done by Ed Carney as part of his master's project with us. And one of the things that came out, this is for an individual beach on an individual storm. The bottom plot here just shows change in volume around a single beach slope. And this is looking at the initial dune toe elevation pre-storm versus the maximum total water level. We were lucky enough actually to be able to get LiDAR surveys flown over this every day for 5 days during the event to look at how the upper beach morphology was changing. What was clearly shown was that the places where we had lower dune toes at the beginning of the storm were far more susceptible to the erosion than higher ones. And this kind of makes sense. However, being able to estimate water levels still becomes really hard. We may have a good estimate of things like tides, surge maybe not too badly, but run-up we're often using things like empirical equations, such as, for example, the Stockton equation, and those also have a lot of inherent uncertainties associated with them. And so how do we get beyond that, particularly if a model has got a binary switch that says is dune erosion going to occur, and we're only going to look at the relative contributions here of where the dune toe was to an estimate of a total water level. So one of the works that Tom had done in there was looking at, well, we've got machine learning, we can start to train models, we can look at ensembles of models, and therefore we can actually get an ensemble prediction of what the run-up may have been using the estimates of the wave characteristics. And that actually can be trained for example, an empirical model such as a Larson impact model. And we do fairly well at being able to predict the time evolution of the dune toe over that same storm I showed you in the last one, just by looking at a distribution of run-ups that were expected for there. Now, also onto that one though, we looked at site-specific data. Again, these models which are trying to resolve a lot of processes, the key challenge though is that they have a large number of free parameters, and knowing how to tune them. The default parameters don't necessarily work well out of the box for very different beaches. We find that very much the case here in Australia. This is just some examples from Josh Simmons's PhD, looking at comparing X beach and S beach and calibrating it to a whole bunch of data where we collected. Now, Narrabeen, Bilgola, and Dee Why are all beaches in the northern beaches of Sydney. Probably can drive between them within about 20 minutes. So we can say that most of the characteristics of these beaches are going to be fairly similar. However, looking at calibrating it just to Narrabeen, which is in blue, so the site-specific obviously at Narrabeen to Narrabeen is the same. Whether or not we are calibrating it at Narrabeen and trying to transfer it to other beaches, you see a large drop in skill. If you can calibrate it to the individual beach, we see slightly better. We also did it at 5 different profiles, which is that in the red, and that really points out again that the ability to calibrate these to individual profiles potentially is about the way we're going to get a decent skill. We see less variability on the S-beach model. There's less free parameters to be able to change. Skill scores, though, are also lower as a result. We also found Josh did some work looking at some data in Italy, also found that some of those calibration coefficients are very specific to the type of erosion that's occurring. And here he looked at collision versus overwash, and you can see here clear differences in the distributions from the default parameters, which is the red line, and whether or not we were in the collision in the solid black or the dash line in an overwash regime. And the biggest one here being this S-max term, which is related to the shields parameter. So you think of sheet flow going over a dune. The last thing I'm hoping to touch base on the last couple of minutes I have is just some recent work by Stefano Conti, and I'll acknowledge that Paul Van Wyschen at TU Delft has been working on some similar stuff as part of his PhD. But acknowledging that these process-based models are still fairly empirical, above the mean waterline, can we start to understand a little bit more physics into why dunes are eroding from a geotechnical perspective, and can thus help us remove some of those calibration requirements, as well as potentially include more physics into the models here. So Stefano Conti has just submitted his PhD, so I'm just going to throw out a couple highlights for that, and then you can look at some of the papers if you'd like for more. So we're not the first people to definitely look at this. There was some earlier work by Magnus Larsson and by Lee Erickson and Meg Palmston, all starting to look at this idea of the geotechnical aspects of dune failure. So most of you have all built a sandcastle, and so you understand when you add a little bit of sand, you can start to get vertical walls and build nice castles. You add too much, you end up with a mud pie, and dry sand as well can't hold those. So taking on some of those ideas, and then looking at some of the existing models, such as the wave impact model, which sort of suggests that the sort of force that's by these waves impacting into a dune will cause an instability. Lee Erickson's work looking at dune notching and elastic beam failure models, such as the conceptual sketch there on the right, and then Meg Palmston looking at this dune infiltration into the model. However, in all these cases, there wasn't actually any internal moisture data collected during it, so a lot of this is sort of hypothesized without being able to fully validate it. And that's what we were sticking out to do. So as part of Stefano's work, I think we ran 40 or 50 different cases here. We looked at 2 different wave conditions, a small wave condition and a large wave condition here. We pre-seasoned a beach for here and marked that on the side of our glass walls of our tanks to understand where the sandbar naturally would go, and redid this profile at the start of every one of our tests. Then we looked at 3 different water levels, so a lower still water level just on the foreshore, one at the dune toe, and then the third one was 1/3 up the dune face to represent more of a surge case. And then lastly, we looked at 3 different moisture contents, sort of a background dry moisture content that you would see in a typical beach. One close to field saturation here, so the water is being held up against gravity. And then the third case was fully saturated, and so we had to continuously sort of wet the top of a dune, kind of like a simulation of rain from the top to keep that there. So this was the inherently more unstable one. Now, some of the key results that we found from here, so the internal dune moisture did show an effect on both the rate and the magnitude of the dune erosion, and there's an example of just sort of 3 of the tests for the different field capacity, saturated and minimum there, and you can see the saturated case erodes slightly faster and slightly further, and this could occur up to 20 to 35% more on fully saturated dunes, and so this is important to understand. He also found in there that we came up with sort of some patterns looking at internal dune moisture dynamics, and those determined the types of failure mechanisms that we saw as well. And so we broke these down into things like scarp formation at the initial part of the dune, and then we saw on unsaturated dunes we could see shear failure in both the absence of notching as well as in the presence of notching, and notching occurred when the dune had sufficiently eroded so that the R2 run-up limit was sort of just at the base of the dune and could notch this out. However, on saturated dunes, with a large excess pore pressure that was existing in there, we only could see the shear failure in the absence of notching, and we typically did see also one more failure after the waves could no longer reach that, and we would hypothesize this was due to that excess pore pressure removing out. Now the last thing I'm just going to point out some recent stuff that we've just submitted to, for review. Digging into this more, we're starting to look at running models such as GeoStudio to understand the internal moisture dynamics and groundwater dynamics, but also finding that the run-up trigger that we're seeing here, it's really the downrush of that run-up that is leaving an excess pore pressure in the dune in unsaturated conditions, and that's when we tended to see these failures occur and this drop of instability. In more fully saturated cases, though, where we have this sort of excess pore pressure and continuous exiting of water due to the lower water levels that we have relative to the dune, these cases were more inherently unstable as a result of that. We also found, though, that the slumped sand when we occurred, and this was also something that Paul found in some of his work in the field, that slumped sand added to be able to protect the dune in front of it, both by providing a restoring force to the dune when we think of a geotechnical stability there, and once that sand was fully eroded away, then we would start to attack the dune again, and we'd start to see additional dune failure onto there. So that is storm impact modeling from my group in a nutshell. And again, thank you to all my amazing students who have really contributed all the work here that I have shown. Thank you very much.